What happens when a husband stands in a courtroom and laughs at his wife over a $12 shirt, then uses their own daughter to prove she isn't fit to be a mother? In front of a judge, lawyers, and strangers, he turns humiliation into a weapon and calls it responsibility. But what he doesn't understand is this. When a woman stays silent under public shame, it isn't weakness, it's timing. They say pride comes before the fall. But when the person who once promised forever becomes your opponent in court, do you protect his image for the sake of family? Or do you let the truth deliver the lesson you never could? Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next twist in this journey. Now, let's listen to her from the heart. The family courtroom in Charleston, South Carolina felt colder than I expected, though the air conditioning hummed softly above the polished wooden benches. I walked in, wearing a simple $12 shirt from a discount store, plain slacks and low heels that had seen better days. My hair was tied back neatly and I wore almost no makeup. Every detail of my appearance was intentional. I wasn't there to impress anyone. I was there to let Grant see exactly what he believed I had become: small, defeated, and powerless. The room was crowded. Grant's attorney sat confidently at the front table, a thick stack of documents arranged with surgical precision. Behind them sat Maribel Vaughn, poised and elegant, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed victory, before a single word had been spoken. A few familiar faces from Grant's business circle filled the gallery, whispering quietly. At the back of the room, my daughter Leora sat beside a court-appointed guardian. Her small hands were folded tightly in her lap, and her worried eyes searched for mine. I gave her a gentle nod, silently promising that everything would be okay. When the hearing began, Grant stood up with a smirk that felt sharper than any insult. His voice was smooth, confident, and loud enough to ensure everyone heard every word. "Your Honor," he said, gesturing slightly in my direction, "my wife can't even afford our daughter's private school tuition." He went on to paint a picture of me as unstable and incapable. He emphasized that I was unemployed, living in a modest rental apartment, and standing before the court without legal representation. Each word was calculated, rehearsed, and delivered with a hint of amusement. The courtroom listened. Some faces remained neutral, others revealed subtle judgment. I didn't interrupt. I didn't object. I let his attorney reinforce the narrative, an overwhelmed mother clinging to dignity she could no longer afford. Inside, however, I was calm. I memorized every accusation, every exaggerated claim. Grant thought he was burying me. In truth, he was digging his own grave one statement at a time. Then came the moment that shifted the atmosphere. The judge looked down at the file, then back at me. "For the record, please state your full legal name." I straightened slightly and spoke clearly. "Callista Wren Ashford." I did not say Holloway. I had legally removed my married name 3 months earlier when I filed my counter-petition for divorce. The change in the room was immediate and palpable. The judge paused, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly as he studied me more closely. Grant's attorney leaned toward him and whispered something urgent. Behind them, Maribel sat up straighter, her confidence flickering for the first time. I didn't look at Grant, but I heard the sharp intake of his breath. The name Ashford carried weight. I knew it. But I also knew that if I wielded it recklessly, I would lose the very independence I had fought so hard to protect. After a brief exchange with the court clerk, the judge cleared his throat. "We will take a 20-minute recess. There are supplemental documents submitted this morning that the court needs to review." The gavel struck lightly. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. I remained seated, composed. Unlike everyone else, I wasn't surprised. I had been expecting those supplemental documents. As the courtroom emptied for the recess, memories surfaced, memories I had buried for over a decade. 12 years earlier, I wasn't just Callista. I was the only daughter of Senator Theodore Ashford. My childhood was shaped by campaign events, press briefings, and late-night policy discussions around a polished dining table. Every step of my future had been carefully mapped out: elite education, a strategic marriage, a public life that reflected the Ashford legacy. Then I met Grant. Back then, he was a junior financial analyst, ambitious, driven, and refreshingly unaffected by politics. He didn't know who I was, and that was exactly why I fell in love with him. For the first time, I felt seen as a person, not a last name. When my father discovered our relationship, he strongly objected. He believed Grant lacked the pedigree and stability expected of someone connected to our family. Faced with an impossible choice, I chose love. I cut ties with my family, signed documents temporarily relinquishing access to my trust fund, and walked away from the Ashford name in everything but legal identity. I built a quiet life working as an accountant, managing our home, and later raising our daughter. Grant never pressed for details about my past, and I never volunteered them. I believed that if his love was genuine, it didn't need the weight of my family's influence. For years, our life was modest but happy. That began to change after Leora was born. Grant started coming home late, citing business dinners and expanding responsibilities. Soon there were frequent work trips to Savannah and Atlanta. His phone became guarded. His tone grew distant. As an accountant, numbers spoke to me more clearly than words. I began noticing irregularities, unusual expenses transfers that didn't align with company reports, and charges that suggested a lifestyle far beyond what Grant claimed. One evening, while reviewing a shared email account we rarely used, I stumbled upon a lease agreement for a luxury penthouse in Atlanta. The name on the document was Maribel Vaughn. When I confronted Grant, he brushed it off, calling her a business partner and the property a temporary corporate accommodation. But the details didn't add up. Quietly, I began gathering information: bank statements, transaction records, archived emails. What I discovered changed everything. Maribel wasn't just a colleague. She was listed as a co-owner of a shell company that received funds routed from accounts linked to Grant's firm. I didn't confront him. Instead, I documented everything. I reached out discreetly to an old college friend who had since worked in a federal auditing office. I wanted clarity, not chaos. Most of all, I wanted to shield Leora from a scandal that could shatter her sense of security. Then came the most chilling discovery. While reviewing insurance correspondence, I found a draft for a high-value life insurance policy Grant had initiated. In its earliest version, Maribel was listed as the primary beneficiary. Though the policy had not been finalized, the intent was unmistakable. In a later draft, my name appeared, but inconsistencies in the paperwork suggested manipulation and shifting plans. I sat in silence that night, staring at the documents spread across my dining table. The question echoed in my mind: was he planning to leave me or destroy me? That was the moment I stopped reacting and started acting. Before Grant could make his next move, I filed for divorce. Quietly, strategically, and with every piece of evidence secured. I didn't tell my father. I didn't seek protection from the Ashford name. This was a battle I chose to fight on my own terms for my dignity and for Leora's future. As the courtroom doors reopened and the recess ended, I returned to my seat with steady resolve. Grant believed he was facing a weakened woman in a $12 shirt. He had no idea he was standing on the edge of consequences he had set in motion long before this day. Grant was blindsided when he learned that I had filed for divorce before he could make his move. The shock on his face that day was brief, quickly replaced by cold determination. Within a week, he hired one of the most aggressive family law attorneys in Charleston and filed for full custody of Leora. His argument was carefully constructed and painfully predictable. I lacked financial stability, my employment history was inconsistent, and I had no meaningful support system. He presented polished financial statements showing that his income was 5 times higher than mine, complete with charts, investment summaries, and projected earnings. What Grant didn't know was that I had already studied those numbers in detail. I recognized patterns transfers that didn't align with legitimate business operations, inflated revenue streams, and payments routed through obscure accounts. A significant portion of the wealth he flaunted came from misappropriated funds tied to a transportation contract his company managed. 3 months earlier, I had quietly submitted a comprehensive package of evidence to federal authorities. I never told Grant. I never used the Ashford name to pressure anyone. I simply handed over the truth and allowed the process to unfold in silence. Meanwhile, Maribel stopped hiding. She began appearing publicly at Grant's side at business events, restaurants, and eventually across social media. One post caught my attention, a photo of the Atlanta penthouse captioned, "A Fresh Start." I recognized the designer furniture in the background. Several pieces had been purchased using Grant's corporate credit card. As I continued reviewing financial trails, I discovered that Maribel had opened an account in the Bahamas. Funds from a shell company connected to Grant were being funneled directly into it. At home, the emotional toll was far more difficult to manage than the financial revelations. Leora began asking why her father no longer lived with us. Her questions were simple, but each one carried a weight that pressed heavily on my chest. I reassured her gently, never speaking ill of Grant. I knew that if the investigation became public too soon, she might one day read the details online or hear them from classmates. I faced a painful decision: accelerate the exposure of the truth or allow the legal process to unfold at its intended pace. A week before our court date, I received confirmation from federal investigators that a formal summons for Grant had been prepared. However, they chose to wait until after key proceedings in family court, given the financial implications tied to custody. I understood then that what lay ahead would not be limited to a divorce decree. The consequences would reach every corner of the life Grant had built on deception. As I walked into the courtroom for the next hearing, I was no longer the woman being judged. I was someone who knew that the truth was no longer hidden. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be acknowledged. When the court reconvened after the 20-minute recess, the atmosphere was subtly different, though Grant appeared confident on the surface. His attorney, Todd Whitmore, resumed the proceedings by presenting a detailed overview of Grant's financial standing. He highlighted income statements, investment portfolios, company shares, and property holdings, painting a portrait of a successful, financially stable father. In contrast, I was portrayed as a mother with limited means and uncertain prospects. I listened carefully, noting every figure and claim. At least 40% of the assets being presented were tied to funds that had questionable origins. Still, I remained silent. There was no need to interrupt. The more confidently they presented distorted financial truths, the more significant the impact would be when those claims were scrutinized. Judge Alder leaned forward and requested that both parties submit complete financial records from the past 6 months. When he asked specifically about a company called Vaughn Logistics Solutions, Todd Whitmore hesitated briefly before describing it as a routine business partnership. I knew better. That entity functioned as a conduit channeling funds from a federally funded transportation program that Grant's firm managed. Moments later, Judge Alder informed the court that his office had received correspondence from a federal auditing authority indicating that an active financial investigation was underway involving matters relevant to the defendant. He did not disclose specifics, but he ordered the information to be entered into the official court record. For the first time during the hearing, Grant turned and looked directly at me, suspicion and unease replacing his earlier confidence. I remained composed. This was only the beginning. I had not asked for immediate action, but the presence of a federal inquiry within the courtroom changed the stakes entirely. Grant responded by addressing the court personally. He accused me of attempting to destroy his reputation out of jealousy and resentment. He reminded the judge that I had once distanced myself from my own family, implying emotional instability. He went further, suggesting that I was manipulating the situation by invoking the Ashford name to intimidate and influence the proceedings. When it was my turn to speak, I calmly stated that throughout our entire marriage, I had not used or accessed any financial resources from the Ashford family. I offered to provide 10 years of bank statements and financial records to support that claim. The effect was immediate. The narrative that I was a privileged woman hiding behind family power collapsed in front of the court. By late afternoon, the judge adjourned the session for the day, requesting the additional documentation from both sides. As I exited the courthouse, my phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "If you push this, everyone falls." I paused on the courthouse steps, reading the words again. The message was not subtle. It carried fear, urgency, and desperation. Grant was beginning to panic. I slipped the phone back into my bag and took a steady breath. When people who have built their lives on lies start to feel the ground shift beneath them, they often become unpredictable. From that moment on, I understood that this was no longer just a divorce. It had become a calculated battle between truth and desperation, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. That evening, after leaving the courthouse, I drove to a quiet federal building on the outskirts of Charleston. The sun had already set, and the city lights reflected faintly off the glass facade as I stepped inside. I had been instructed to meet the federal agent overseeing Grant's case in a private conference room. The atmosphere was calm, but carried the unmistakable weight of consequences approaching. Agent Daniel Reeves greeted me with a firm handshake. He was composed, professional, and direct. I placed a folder on the table containing additional documentation I had gathered over the past weeks, bank transfer records, corporate expense statements, and evidence linking funds from Grant's company to an offshore account in the Bahamas under Maribel Vaughn's name. Reeves reviewed the documents carefully, occasionally nodding as he compared them with information already in their possession. He confirmed that federal authorities had been monitoring Grant's financial activities for nearly 4 months. The investigation was extensive, but one critical component was still missing: direct testimony from the ultimate beneficiary of the offshore account. That beneficiary was Maribel. Without her cooperation, the case would rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. With it, the path to prosecution would become significantly stronger. In the days that followed, subtle changes began to surface. Through publicly accessible legal filings and discreet inquiries, I learned that Maribel had quietly started searching for her own legal representation. Not long after, an email surfaced in the investigative records, one she had sent to Grant. In it, she demanded assurances of financial protection if things go wrong. The tone was no longer affectionate or confident. It was anxious and transactional. Their alliance, once built on secrecy and shared ambition, was beginning to fracture. Money had bound them together, and now the threat of losing it was pulling them apart. Grant, sensing the shift in control, intensified his efforts against me. He filed an emergency motion seeking temporary custody of Leora, arguing that I was entangled in a sensitive political investigation due to my connection to the Ashford family. His strategy was to reframe the federal inquiry into a supposed conspiracy orchestrated by my father. During the subsequent hearing, I addressed the court directly and stated under oath that I had voluntarily renounced access to my family's trust and had maintained complete financial independence throughout my marriage. I offered comprehensive bank statements covering the past decade as proof. The judge acknowledged this declaration, effectively dismantling Grant's attempt to portray the investigation as politically motivated. Amid these legal maneuvers, the emotional toll on Leora deepened. Grant attempted to contact her outside of his scheduled visitation, telling her that I was trying to send her father to prison. When she returned home that evening, her eyes were filled with confusion and fear. She asked whether she had done something wrong and whether her father was in danger. I knelt beside her, reassuring her that none of this was her fault. I chose my words carefully, protecting her innocence, while avoiding any direct condemnation of Grant. Of all the battles I faced, shielding my daughter from guilt and emotional harm was the most difficult. Shortly thereafter, a significant development emerged. A former employee from Grant's company reached out to federal investigators. This individual provided internal emails confirming that Grant had personally instructed staff to alter financial reports to conceal irregularities. The emails bore Grant's electronic signature and included Maribel as a copied recipient, directly linking her to the scheme. Agent Reeves informed me that with this new evidence, the issuance of an arrest warrant was imminent and could occur within the week. Despite the gravity of the situation, I felt no sense of triumph. Instead, a quiet emptiness settled within me. The man I had once loved, the father of my child, was witnessing the collapse of the life he had constructed through deception. As I prepared for the next court hearing, I understood that the moment ahead would be irreversible, not just legally, but emotionally as well. By the time the next hearing arrived, word of the federal investigation had spread throughout the community. The courtroom was noticeably more crowded than before, filled with observers, legal professionals, and individuals drawn by the unfolding drama. Grant entered with a composure that seemed almost forced. His posture was rigid, his expression controlled, yet there was a tension about him that had not been present in earlier proceedings. Maribel was conspicuously absent, a detail that did not escape anyone's notice. As the session prepared to begin, a quiet exchange occurred at the defense table. Grant's attorney received a document and quickly reviewed its contents. The color drained from his face as he leaned toward Grant to whisper the news Maribel had entered into a cooperation agreement with federal authorities. She had agreed to provide complete documentation of the financial transfers and her involvement in the offshore accounts in exchange for consideration regarding her own legal exposure. Grant's reaction was immediate and visceral. The confidence he had clung to began to unravel as the reality of his isolation became undeniable. Despite this development, Grant persisted in his request for full custody of Leora, attempting to maintain the appearance of control. However, before the judge could rule on the matter, the courtroom doors opened. 2 U.S. federal marshals entered with quiet authority, their presence commanding instant attention. They approached Grant and, in a calm but firm manner, informed him that he needed to accompany them in connection with an ongoing criminal investigation. Although this was not yet a final conviction, it marked the formal initiation of criminal proceedings against him. Judge Alder immediately responded by suspending Grant's petition for custody pending the resolution of the criminal case. The decision underscored the court's obligation to prioritize the welfare and stability of Leora. Grant, now visibly shaken, turned toward me with a mixture of anger and desperation. He accused me of orchestrating the entire situation, insisting that I had used the Ashford name to destroy him. When given the opportunity to respond, I spoke only once, calmly stating that I had simply allowed the truth to reach the appropriate authorities. This was not an act of revenge, but the inevitable consequence of the choices he had made long before our marriage began to unravel. As the marshals prepared to escort him from the courtroom, Grant paused and looked back at me. His voice, though strained, carried a final warning. He claimed that there were still secrets I did not know, suggesting that deeper layers of his financial dealings remained hidden. The statement lingered in the air, raising the unsettling possibility that the legal battle was not yet fully concluded. When the courtroom gradually emptied, the tension gave way to a quiet stillness. Leora ran toward me, wrapping her arms tightly around my waist. I held her close, feeling both relief and uncertainty. We had taken a significant step forward, but I understood that the journey toward true resolution was not yet complete. Standing there, surrounded by the fading echoes of the day's events, I realized that while one chapter of this struggle had ended, the path toward healing and final justice still lay ahead. After Grant was escorted out of the courtroom by the U.S. federal marshals, an unexpected silence settled over the space he had once dominated. People whispered, reporters scribbled notes, and the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. Yet as I sat there holding Leora close, I felt no sense of victory. There was no triumph in watching the man I had once loved walk away in handcuffs. Instead, his final words echoed in my mind with unsettling clarity. "There are still secrets you don't know." In the days that followed, federal investigators contacted me with new concerns. While much of Grant's financial network had been uncovered, there remained an additional account that had not yet been fully traced. The account was registered under an anonymous beneficiary, and until its ownership was confirmed, the investigation could not be considered complete. The possibility that this account might somehow implicate me or even Leora was deeply troubling. At the request of the investigators, I provided multiple samples of my signature for comparison. During this process, a troubling discovery emerged. Among Grant's old insurance files was a preliminary draft of a life insurance policy in which he had proposed naming Leora as the beneficiary. I had never been informed of this. While that draft had never been finalized, a separate document surfaced bearing what appeared to be my signature. Upon closer examination, it became clear that the signature was forged. The realization sent a chill through me. If that document had been activated, it could have falsely suggested my involvement in Grant's financial schemes, potentially drawing me into the criminal investigation. As the inquiry continued, a clearer picture of Grant's contingency plan emerged. Investigators revealed that he had attempted to create a narrative in which I appeared to have knowledge of and possibly complicity in his financial dealings. Central to this plan was an email I had sent him 2 years earlier regarding routine bookkeeping adjustments. Grant had retained this message and manipulated its content, removing contextual information to make it appear as though I had endorsed the falsification of financial records. However, forensic analysis of the email's metadata demonstrated that it had been altered only 3 months prior, confirming deliberate tampering. I was subsequently called to provide additional testimony before a federal grand jury. The experience was both intimidating and deeply personal. Grant's new criminal defense attorney sought to portray me as the architect behind a calculated scheme to dismantle his career. To counter these allegations, I voluntarily disclosed 10 years of my personal financial records, employment history, and communications establishing beyond doubt that I had never benefited from the illicit funds. Protecting my reputation was important, but safeguarding Leora's future from the shadow of her father's actions mattered far more. A decisive moment came when a former internal accountant from Grant's company stepped forward as a witness. He confirmed that Grant had personally instructed staff to alter financial statements and manipulate electronic communications. The accountant provided the original, unaltered version of the email I had sent, clearly demonstrating that its meaning had been intentionally distorted. This testimony dismantled any remaining attempt to shift responsibility onto me. Soon after, the prosecutor announced that there was sufficient evidence to formally charge Grant with multiple counts of financial fraud and document falsification. During a subsequent court appearance, I saw him once more. The anger and arrogance that had once defined him were gone, replaced by a hollow resignation. In that moment, I understood that the true climax of this ordeal was not the sight of handcuffs, but the realization that every path of escape had been closed by his own decisions. As I left the courthouse that day, I recognized that the legal battle was nearing its conclusion. What remained was not a matter of law, but of healing and ensuring a stable future for Leora. Grant was officially indicted on federal charges in the months that followed. The family court granted me full custody of Leora, citing the need for stability and emotional security. The judge also recommended that both Leora and I participate in counseling to help us process the trauma of the events we had endured. Grant's assets were frozen and carefully reviewed. Those determined to be legally obtained were preserved to ensure that his future child support obligations could be met. Amid these developments, my father reached out to me for the first time in years. Senator Theodore Ashford invited me to return to Washington and rejoin the family, offering both protection and the opportunity to rebuild my professional life under the Ashford name. I spent many nights reflecting on his proposal. Returning would shield me from public scrutiny and provide undeniable security. However, I could not ignore the reality that Leora would then grow up within the same political environment I had once struggled to escape. Ultimately, I chose a different path. I decided to retain the name Callista Wren Ashford for legal purposes, acknowledging my heritage, but I declined the invitation to re-enter the political sphere. I wanted Leora to grow up in a life defined by authenticity and independence, rather than influence and expectation. During the process of reviewing Grant's legitimate assets, an unexpected discovery emerged. Among the financial records was a modest educational fund he had established for Leora during the early years of our marriage, long before his descent into corruption. The amount was not substantial, but it was sufficient to contribute meaningfully to her future college education. This revelation forced me to confront a painful truth: Grant had not always been the man he ultimately became. There had been a time when he was a devoted father who genuinely cared for his daughter's future. One evening, as we sat together in our living room, Leora looked up at me with quiet uncertainty and asked, "Mom, is Dad a bad person?" Her question pierced my heart. I chose my response carefully, free from bitterness or anger. I explained that her father had made serious mistakes and that every person must face the consequences of their choices. I assured her that while his actions were wrong, it did not erase the love he once had for her. In doing so, I preserved her ability to remember him with compassion while still acknowledging the truth. A year later, Leora and I moved into a small house near the coast of Charleston. The rhythm of the ocean brought a sense of peace that had long been absent from our lives. Drawing upon my professional background, I established an independent financial consulting practice dedicated to helping women recognize and protect themselves from financial deception within marriages and business partnerships. Through this work, I found purpose in transforming my painful experiences into a source of empowerment for others. Looking back, I realized that true power had never resided in the Ashford name or in the federal investigation that brought Grant's actions to light. It was found in the quiet strength required to walk into that courtroom wearing a $12 shirt to face humiliation with dignity, and to trust that truth, no matter how painful, would ultimately provide the foundation for a new beginning. I did not prevail because of wealth or influence. I prevailed because I chose honesty over fear, resilience over bitterness, and hope over despair. And in that choice, Leora and I found not just justice, but the promise of a future built on integrity and peace.